Welcome to the Global Discussion, a discussion with creatives, leaders and thinkers. My name is Simon Hodgkins. Today, a real pleasure to be joined by Lexie Kirkconnell Kawana. Lexie, you're very welcome to the show. Let's begin by asking you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do for our audience.
Yes, thank you very much for having me, Simon. As you said, my name's Lexie Kirkconnell Kawana. I am the Chief Executive of the UK's independent press regulator. So we provide news publishers with ethics and governance and standard services and ensure that the public have access to redress when they experience media harms.
That sounds very exciting. There's a lot in that because I suppose when you think of press and media, there's been an awful lot of change. We've seen technology, we've seen artificial intelligence, we've seen good journalism and bad journalism. We've seen people on both sides of that argument. You're the CEO of this organization. How did that come about? How did that organization first come together? And what was your journey like to become the CEO of that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, as you say, journalism, news media is a long tradition here in Britain, and for the best part of the last 7 decades, we've really struggled to get the balance right between the freedom of the press on the one hand and the rights of individuals to be free from intrusion and discrimination and other sorts of media harms that are out there. So after many government inquiries over the decades, we have come to the kind of conclusion as a public that we've not got that balance right, and we need a regulatory body in place that will be independent, but also effective at regulating the press to ensure that there are really high standards of journalism and that people can trust the news that they use. So Impress was a fledgling idea in 2012, 2013 after the Leveson inquiry in the UK, which found widespread illegality, phone hacking of people up and down the country. And the notion was, why don't we create something from civil society that is for the public, by the public, doesn't have any involvement of government or politicians, and is sufficiently independent from the industry so that they can't game the rules and systems in their favour. So it's now been operational for 8 years and has successfully onboarded hundreds of news publishers up and down the country who are subject to the rules and regulations of Impress and follow our code of conduct. Now, my background, I'm a lawyer and a career regulator. You'll hear the Antipodean accent. I'm from New Zealand originally, and I came to the UK around 8 years ago now to take on the exciting challenge of media regulation here. And I've done all sorts of media regulation. I've done regulation of film and television, of advertising, and of illegal content, terrorist content, child abuse content. And so this is my stock and trade. And 6 years ago now, I joined Impress to build out its regulatory team and capacity, because it's a very new proposition. No one's really done anything like this before here in the UK. And over the course of those years, seen a lot of shift and change in the news media and the industry we regulate, but also in the proposition that we have, because it is a values-based one, and news media aren't required to be regulated by law. News publishers choose to adopt these standards. So we've had to really make sure that what we do aligns not only with the public's needs, but their needs as well, and is fit for purpose. So 18 months ago, I stepped up and took over leading the organization, leading us through this change cycle and making sure that we are still relevant and fit for purpose for the digital age.
It sounds both intriguing and extremely difficult all in one go, because it's an age-old tradition, journalism, particularly in the UK market. It can be ferocious at times, it can be informative at times, it can be completely topsy-turvy at other times. And you mentioned the Leveson inquiry, and that had a big impact on people, and the repercussions of that and the ripple effects of that continue today. And I'm sure a lot of the work that you do at Impress, as you say, getting news agencies and organizations to buy into a set of regulations, really, to come on board, is, I would imagine, something that takes a little bit of time and effort on your part. When it comes to things like redress and people dealing with those kind of issues when it comes to mainstream press, I know you do some work in this space, don't you?
Yes, absolutely. And Press was founded to provide redress to those victims that had experienced harm, not just the harms of that were identified as part of the Leveson inquiry, but the new types of harms that have come along as everyone has shifted their news use online, and publishers have gravitated there as well. And it is a new set of challenges. And what has happened as people have moved into these new online spaces is what has really fallen away is the guardrails. Who do I go to when I've got an issue and a problem? If I'm being harassed, if my privacy is being invaded, if someone's defaming me online, there are really no clear pathways for how you right that wrong, particularly against big media, but also against each other. And one of the pillars and Press is really focused on now is how do we build a culture around people finding alternative ways to resolve conflict and dispute, to redress harm, without having to go to lawyers and the courts and really, really difficult, complex processes to get outcomes that are in their interests, but also have their rights affirmed and those wrongs put to right. So Impress provides one of the only recognised arbitration services in the UK where individuals, media organisations, anyone in the Creative Commons and information space can come and use those services to resolve those types of issues. And for us, a big piece around that is educating the public that they do have these rights, that they do have services out there that can help resolve them for them, and that there are new ways of doing things to get recourse. And all of this is to the end of making sure that our media spaces and our information spaces are safe spaces to participate in, so that if you're on a news site, that the news has been made with integrity, that no one's been harmed in the making of that news, and you can trust what you read. Similarly, when you're online, if you're on social media, if you're on a messaging app or a platform or a website, feeling confident in that space and that what you're seeing, what you're reading, what you're participating in, has guardrails, has backstops as well.
So, from redress and having those avenues and assistance for people that are looking at that from various news outlets, you're also promoting the integrity and freedom of the press too. So it comes at it from those two very important angles. And my next question is about when I think about whether it's US politics or UK politics, when I think about the type of, I suppose, what would have been traditional news outlets and some of the more modern news outlets, possibly those that are online only as opposed to printed media or television and radio media. There's an awful lot of different types of news media and coverage out there. And it goes from people that try to uphold a moral standard to people that really are just churning out anything. And then we have maybe politicians or people of influence or people of power, um, in some respect, saying things that, when they're fact checked, just aren't true. And that can't be helping the bigger picture. Have you got any views on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I like to think of myself, from the perspective of, your average, Joe or Jane looking for information out there that I can trust and I can rely on, that can help me make sense of the world around me, help guide my decisions that I take, whether that's my democratic decisions, my right to vote, or whether or not that's, the weather and looking outside and what I'm going to be, wear that day. And the fact is we're in an information environment now where we're inundated with all sorts of information. A lot of that is not accurate, doesn't have integrity. We've got actors out there that are trying to peddle false information, and, a whole cottage industry built around spreading mis and disinformation as well. So people being able to have sources of information that they can rely on and trust is very important, but not just trust, that is trustworthy as well. And the fact is that we haven't got very good systems in place for indicating that trustworthiness to them, to members of the public. And we put a lot of the burden on average people to have to find that for them. So the Impress proposition and the partners we work with in the trusted information space are always thinking about what are the ways that we can simplify this for ordinary folks, give them good indicators for what trusted news and information can look like, and help them make those information decisions accordingly. And when we think about the different players that are out there, as you mentioned, there are some of those traditional media outlets, there are some of those new media outlets, and we're seeing the rise of a lot of influencers that provide a lot of news and social commentary. All of these, different actors have responsibilities for what they put out there. Whether or not they're held to account for those responsibilities is something that we, should all aspire towards collectively. And what Impress is seeking to do is create that sort of mass movement of publishers and providers that want to be able to put that stamp of integrity on their work and say to their readers and audiences, you can trust us because ultimately there is a backstop if we get things wrong, which people do from time to time. But that's what's, I think, key, is how we signal that to the public, how the public responds to that, and always keeping that dialogue and that conversation ongoing.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. And I know you obviously have a standards code that people adhere to, and whether you are a journalist who's been supported through that code, or whether you're a member of the public, I suppose, who is maybe needs support from unethical reporting and practices. That's one area of it. But I want to bring in, if I can, the word traditional media again, in terms of, we hear, don't we? I've been hearing for a decade or so. We were talking before we started recording about the collapse of traditional media. And it seems as though, news outlets can pop up left, right, and center. And then I think of somebody like, just thinking about it in a more modern context, people who were, on mainstream, well-regarded information channels, setting up like a podcast. I'm thinking in your market, for example, the news agents, became a very successful podcast overnight, offering, discussion and dialogue around the news events of the time. And they brought with it some press credentials, I suppose, TV and other credentials to that. But is there a collapse of traditional media? Is is the brand element of traditional media a quality and a source of trust that we can go to? Because there have been accusations and challenges in lots of areas with some very large organizations too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we go down to the nuts and bolts of it, the traditional news media model was based on, we're going to provide you a free product, information, well sourced from journalists, asking the right questions that are relevant to you. But the model behind that is you as the audience are then the product we cross-sell to advertisers or suppliers who want to sell you products, services, experiences, etc. And the disruption of that model is, along came some very big tech companies that said, well, we can do that better. We can sell audience as a product much more effectively than news providers can, and really gazumped them on the provision of that service, which meant that yes, there are still some very successful traditional news publishers out there that still have a lot of audience affiliation, that are trusted as a news brand, that will continue to be loyal to those news brands. But the model itself that sits behind it has really faltered and collapsed. And what we have to think about in that context of change is, again, where and how people are getting their information, and making sure that that information has integrity to it. And that's very challenging because of how information distribution has changed. When you ask the average member of the public now where they get their news, they will say they would get it online. But when you drill down into that and you say, what do you mean online? They'll all of a sudden start to list a whole bunch of different sources of information. And, you know, less than 25 years ago, they would have said their favorite household name news brand. That's where they got their information from. And so recognizing the speed of that change, the significance of that change, is really important when we're going to have conversations about information, news standards, journalism standards, and what that means for the changing news consumption model. Now, yes, of course, there's lots of new types of news brands popping up. Brand is still really important. When you ask people what are the pillars of why they trust and use news, they'll say brand reputation is still really strong, but that is changing. When you survey anyone under the age of 35 now, personality is much more important than brand. So they are looking for affinity with individuals, and they will go and cross-check that information that they're receiving from a variety of sources, which is a very different way to how you know, generations above them would consume news. So there's a lot of change, there's a lot of challenge. Our function, our purpose is to meet people where they are and say, where you're getting your news information from, you should be looking for these standards, and know that they're being applied and that they're being held responsible to them, if you want to trust the news you're receiving.
That makes sense. And I suppose, just to maybe go on just a little bit from what you're saying there, isn't there also this added problem with trustworthy news sources, and brand obviously being part of that, as you say, but with algorithms today and those big tech companies and social media, and where people are getting various sources from, it can become a bit of an echo chamber. So whatever you start to be fed, you're not actually sourcing it, it's being actually directed to you via algorithms. And then your belief system maybe starts to change, and then it starts to be reinforced by that other information that's coming to you. So when you start to look at the various levels that are impacting just getting to the truth,
Mm.
and one version of, well, what's a fact and what's not a fact, that's a very murky, difficult conversation at the moment, isn't it?
It's very difficult, and you know, we're the first organization to hold up our hands and say we're not the arbiters of truth. It's not the role that we have to play, and quite frankly, no one should be playing that role. That's what's inherent to freedom of expression and freedom of information and the exchange of ideas and beliefs. What we do think, however, is that we're entering an age where being able to cross-reference sources and come to an objective standing about observable empirical facts is really challenging. As you say, when people retreat into those silos, as I've said before, we're in the age of information saturation, and we are behaviorally not designed to take on all this information and be able to process it and do that sense making ourselves. So we have to come to some consensus on what that is. Now, our standards code reflect very long-standing journalistic principles about how you get closer to accurate information, how you get closer to the truth. But what we don't see now are those principles being applied to how information is produced and pumped out as it is by a variety of different sources that are just trying to get attention and eyeballs on their content for the purposes of engagement. Similar to what we talked about before, tethering people into environments where they can sell them stuff. So it's about, how do we introduce those principles again to how we come to information, because they're very good ones. They're ones that have been tried and tested over hundreds of years now. And they're not ones we should abandon just because we're getting a lot of information all at once now in a scale that we've not seen before.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And one last thing, because I do want to ask you something else in a moment, but I was talking to somebody very recently about the content providers, or in this case, we could say the news providers. But they were saying in the age of TikTok, for example, the algorithm there is slightly different to the way social media 2.0 has worked, whereas it was kind of you like something, um, or you retweeted it, reposted it, added a comment, those kind of things, and they want to keep you on the app, as you say. It's all about the eyeballs, it's all about the advertisers, it's all about the dopamine hit. And TikTok came along, and it's kind of like, well, if you like this kind of stuff, we'll just serve you more of that, and we'll keep you here longer. And the point they were making was that the more you sort of do that action where you're scrolling through a feed on your phone, they were making the argument to me, and I'd be interested to get your viewpoint on it, that the relationship between the content creator, the news outputter, and the consumer is being weakened by that type of activity. Because to some degree, you don't really mind where it's coming from, it's whether it's actually stuff that you like. And to your point about influencers. So that must also be a hurdle that you have to get back to when you're talking about publishing with integrity and coming back to quality sources. It's very hard when you're in that, doom scrolling is a term for sure, mode where it's just being served to you based on previous likes to keep you within an app.
Absolutely. And the whole point, one of the qualities we've lost because we've had very little regulation around these platforms and their business models and how their algorithms work, is reintroducing friction so that we create pause, so we can bring critical analysis back to how we consume media. And to me, this is something really fundamental to human behavior. People love a story, a narrative. We're inherently storytellers, and being able to have affinity with other storytellers is one of the great democratizing forces of the digital experience. However, as I said before, we need to be able to have some consensus and understanding to be able to participate in society at large, in our communities, in our homes. And we have started to lose the balance of that in favor of the storytellers, in favor of the engagement, in favor of the affinity, and away from that objectivity and that community sense making that needs to take place. Because when it's just you in an app, you don't have other references, point of references around you confirming or dismissing your experience. And so it's a little bit about the individual over the consensus or the collective. It's a little bit about getting the balance right, introducing a little bit of that friction back. But the fact is that these companies are incredibly large. They trend monopolistically. They are a capitalist function, so their bottom line is towards their businesses and their shareholders. They're not towards the civic and democracy. So it's about how we wrest some of that power back, and decide as communities and as a society whether or not that pathway down towards that hyper-individuated, hyper-personalized content over meaning and sense-making and experience is more important to us. And that is part of the democratic, regulatory lawmaking conversation I think is happening across the world right now. What I think is really important for that is making sure that the public, representative groups, civil society are part of that conversation. And my concern is we're not inviting the public enough to participate in the conversation. At the moment, it feels very much like a conversation between big tech and big government. And what we need is more spaces where people can discuss this and talk about, well, what's their vision for a new media? What's their vision for a new information economy? What's their vision for digital spaces? And start to build that up. Because I think from there, that's when we'll start to get something really exciting happening and address some of the perverse consequences of where we are now.
Yeah, and I think what you touched on there is obviously that more of a democratic way outside of big company or big tech and government, where a conversation is taking place. So maybe outside of government as well, there's a whole other conversation that needs to take place, and then that sort of human movement, that civil society type of approach to it. I understand that. That makes a lot of sense. Um, and what about AI though? Because AI has got to be on your radar, right? Particularly with, we started off talking about AI and it's okay, but it makes mistakes and then it hallucinates, and then OpenAI or others, Google or whoever, will bring out newer models, and they seem to be getting more intelligent. They're passing the bar. They're analyzing healthcare information, faster than any humans can. And I don't know where that ends up, but that must have a big impact on the quality and the trust and the integrity of sources.
Absolutely. I mean, when we started to see these first public use cases of particularly generative AI, which is, I think, the top of mind of people at the moment, because automation and machine learning has been going on for decades now, right? And they do have a lot of really interesting applications in healthcare, in agriculture, in finance. But when we're looking at information and how people are accessing information, a lot of these companies, I think these use cases were about normalizing the public to starting to see Gen AI as it was integrated into other types of appliances. And we have to, watch who are the companies, the big companies investing in AI right now. They're our standard digital services providers. So Google, Amazon, Apple, the likes. I mean, that's why, Gemini and iPhone 16 and those variations, all of them are going to start to have Gen AI integrations in them, and users, consumers are going to start to become inured to seeing information presented to them in that way. But obviously, what we also learnt with the release of these products is how these products are built, which is largely based off existing data sets that these models were trained on by crawling free to use public information that was already out there. So everything on Web 2.0 that was free to access went into building these systems. And one of the key concerns is that while a lot of that information that went into that was good information, a lot of information that went into it was bad information, and the models didn't distinguish between either in terms of putting that into the system. So we got a lot of, it's the standard phrase, garbage in, therefore garbage out. And we started to see examples of that with some early case studies. The thing is, from now, is that in order for these models to advance, they're going to need even more data, even more good information, even more new information. Otherwise, people are not going to use these products, and those integrations are going to fail ultimately, because a big issue with Gen AI is that it does start to cannibalize itself if it doesn't get new data in for those models. So one thing we're really looking at is how, if we're going down this future, if these companies are going to insist on these integrations, how do we get good information into the models, reduce that bias, get closer to accuracy, make sure that quality information providers are being co-opted, whether that's through licensing arrangements or being sourced and supply to these models their existing information. But also, how do we think about some of the visioning aspects of where we end up with this? So do we want to just get all of our information from one source, which is, Gemini, Alexa, etc., and not cross-refer back to other sources of information? Are we comfortable with that? Do we think we've got a sufficient ethical design around that? And That's the really cutting edge thinking that I'm really interested in. I know partners are interested in, a lot of academics are thinking about as well. But we want to start seeing the companies that are leading on these products and product design thinking about too, and quite transparently, because they've done a lot of experimentation, they've released some early prototypes. I think we need to have confidence as consumers and as the public that they're thinking really seriously about what are the ethical consequences of where these integrations end up.
Oh, you've made some excellent points, and I think, the more that the black box of the algorithms are opened up, the more the data sets are understood, the more maybe we have at least some type of dashboard or control that we can apply to some of these new models. But I'm just wondering, as you were saying there, um, does it come full circle back to exactly the work you're doing? Because ultimately, as you're saying, these new AI models, they need new information. Otherwise, I mean, I'm being, uh, simplistic here, but it becomes just a set of information about stuff we knew that sits on a shelf, a bit like an old encyclopedia set of books. And it needs new information, it needs new content, and it needs new quality content. And we've seen, haven't we, which is where I think it comes back to publishing with integrity, we've seen very large, well-known traditional outlets now being in discussions, selling parts of their content, these data lakes of information, this sort of rubber stamp almost of, well, your content is of a certain level of quality that we want to buy that. And these large tech companies are seeing that to be very valuable content that they're quite willing to pay for. And we have seen a lot of court cases, big ones, where some of that data scraping that you referred to earlier that took place uh, has now had to be redressed itself in terms of financial payments. But going and buying data or doing some kind of licensing agreement around the content, the news, the copy, that's becoming more and more commonplace. So do we end up with maybe not one sense of the news or the information, because that doesn't sound right either, but maybe a smaller group of quality content? Is that utopia, or where do we end up, Lexie?
I mean, I wouldn't call it utopia, but it's certainly the track that, as you say, some big news companies are taking, and some collective, news bodies are looking at as well. And it's certainly encouraging to see these tech companies engaging on that level, because as you say, I think there's something like 17 outstanding copyright suits at the moment that free scraping, I think at least we can call unethical, but these courts will determine if it's illegal or not. So that engagement is encouraging. As I said, though, I think what I would be more encouraged by is standards emerging from the AI and tech industry around what they think quality information looks like, what they're going to engage with the product, so that consumer can make a choice about whether or not to use that product. I know, some of these models have been trained on the bowels of Reddit, and as am I a consumer, am I going to trust the AI product output on the other side of that? That should be my choice to make as a consumer, and it should be really transparent. So while it's encouraging to know that there are quality publishers out there contributing to the data sets, there should be more transparency. There should be guiding principles, and from a consumer and consumer protection perspective, I should be able to know what went into the sausage, if you will, in terms of how much this is going to then impact my experience on my digital service. I don't know about you. Unfortunately, I'm a person who's glued to my phone, and if I knew that all of the output there was coming off AI data sets where I couldn't necessarily trust the source of that information, it would probably change my relationship fundamentally to the applications I was using. So I think that's what I would like to see. That to me is closer to utopia than sort of back alley handshakes between, various companies of, unknown reputation or quality in terms of these deals, and we should, as a public, as a community, be able to demand that. And I don't think that that's a tall ask. It doesn't impact on the intellectual property or the business confidence of these companies, but it does allow us to know more about what's in the tin when it comes to these new products.
Yeah, it's a fine balance between the quality, the code of conduct, the integrity, and freedom of speech, freedom of press, and protecting, people on the other side of that. It's a challenge, and I'm glad there are people like yourself and the team at Impress working on this. And on that note, I want to ask you, if I can, about how you plan in your world, because this environment you're describing is changing literally by the day. So how do you go about planning? What's the next 12 months look like for you, or further out? How does that work in your world? What's on your horizon? What's keeping you up at night? What are you hoping to achieve? How does that work, Lexie?
No, you're totally right. This is, one of the only industries I've worked in where the change has been as accelerated and diverse, I think, in terms of all the aspects it touches on of public life and public influence. It makes every day very interesting for me and my team. And the way we look at planning is we do a lot of forecasting. We do a lot of strategic sessions at all levels of the organization, because it's not for me and my board to be making these decisions. We have a really, really dedicated bunch of people who, for me, are always looking at opportunities, who are forecasting, who are horizon scanning, and able to bring that to the table for these sessions. And that does mean we have to be very agile and adapt, and be prepared to look at our operational plan, look at our project plans, and go, right, we've got to draw a line under this because the context has changed. As a small nonprofit, we have the benefit of that flexibility. We're able to be agile in that way, but also because we're not a statutory body, and we're constituted as for the community benefit. That means that we're not so stuck in what we have to do and what we're mandated to do. We can react and respond to the changing market and the public needs accordingly. In terms of what I'm looking ahead at the future, AI is obviously a big one. The way it's going to reshape information economy is going to be profound. So being able to have a seat at that table as decisions are being made is really important. Advocating for the public to have a seat at the table and think about what public participation in that looks like, given that they're not just end consumers, they've got a public interest in the outcomes of their communities and how they receive and engage in information. But we're also thinking a lot about, how this is affecting globally lots of different media economies. The UK is in a really, really privileged position as a large English-speaking nation that has a lot of global influence, where there's a strong market that these companies want to operate in. But there are all sorts of considerations when we start looking beyond the global north and start thinking about how countries that are often maligned and disregarded by these companies because they're too small, or they use languages that aren't English, how they're going to be sort of left behind by some of these issues. So we're also working with global partners, global bodies, on how we can have that wider conversation with different collectives outside of the global north, and think about what their participation in these conversations look like and how we can bring them to the table as well.
Yeah, it's a fascinating point, because the playing field isn't level. Um, there are certain communities, countries, areas, geographic regions, and communities where it's a pay to play model. So if you want free, you can have it with all the problems that come along with that. And by the way, here's a truckload of advertising to go with it. If you are more affluent and live in a different region or have a different economic situation, maybe you can pay and you can get rid of some of that noise, or you can decide a little bit about where your sources come from. So yeah, fascinating to hear that, and I think that's the global problem. I mean, I just think of some countries when it comes to the work you're doing in the UK, it's magnitude bigger in terms of a problem in many countries around the world. Before we run out of time, Lexie, I want to ask you two final questions. Is there anything that we haven't touched on, or maybe something we have discussed that you'd like to expand upon? Really, some final thoughts for our international audience while we're here together today. And secondly, and finally, if people want to reach out to you and find out about the services that you do, whether it's, public complaints or dispute resolution or redress, or whether it's advisory type services, and they want to get in touch with you or get in touch with Impress, where's the best place to send people to? So two questions to sort of bring us home here.
Certainly. In terms of reaching us, we'd love you to land on our website, impressorg.com, or we're on all socials, impress_reg, and we're very, very open to having conversations. We're always looking for alliances. We're always looking for partners, because this, for me, is a little boats of Dunkirk situation. We are all in this together. We all have a stake in the outcomes. And so this should be about us forming alliances and partnerships to ensure that as many representative interests as possible are part of this conversation about shaping the future of news and information. And to that end, what we are really excited about is, opening up our partnership scheme, is building our supporters network, and operating in different territories potentially in the future, so that we can expand on what we've learned here, what we think works well, and apply those in different contexts. And we are a very, very consultative, co-creative organization. We love also learning and hearing about where others have been successful, and where the best model might lie. I mean, it's all a bit experimental, it's all a bit innovative, but we will land, somewhere to get this balance right. But it requires a real team effort from as many organizations and individuals as possible. So please do get in touch. We'd love to continue this conversation. We love having this conversation. We find it so interesting. And I've never met a person that doesn't want to discuss media, big tech, the future of our information economy. And that's really encouraging. This is something that really, really captures the imagination. As I said, we've all got a stake in it. So we'd love to kick up the conversation with as many people as possible.
Thank you, Lexie. That brings us nicely to the end of our time together today here on the Global Discussion. I want to thank everybody who's watching or listening to this episode around the world, and ask them to like, follow, subscribe, do everything I need you to do to help support the show. And also go and check out everything that Impress are doing, all the great work that Lex and the team are involved in at impressorg.com. That's really important. Get involved there. And hopefully you'll join me back here for some more discussions with creatives and leaders and thinkers just like Lexie. But thanks for being on the show, Lexie. It's great to talk to you again today.
Thank you, Simon. All the best.